Thank you for listening to the Luminous Recovery Yoga podcast, hosted by Kari. The views and opinions expressed here are strictly those of the person who gave them. Take what you like and leave the rest. These views and opinions do not represent any specific 12-step program, only my experience, strength, and hope in recovering from the dis-ease of addiction and codependency. If you'd like to learn more, please visit my website at www.luminousrecoveryyoga.com. Hello, my friend. Thank you so much for joining me today for this episode of the Luminous Recovery Yoga podcast. I'm so happy to share this space with you. It's a space where I share my experience, strength, and hope in recovery, but also how that applies to my yoga practice, because I got into recovery and yoga really at the same time. So it's actually really challenging for me to separate them. I feel that my brain sort of developed alongside both of these really incredible outlets. Recovery, where I get my mind, my emotions, my thinking straight, but then also yoga, where I can learn to embody some of these things on the mat. And I find that when I can embody these principles, when I practice these principles in all of my affairs, including how I'm showing up on the yoga mat, then it's really like having a safe practice space for taking those principles out into the world. I really have strongly always believed that who I am on the mat is who I am in the world. And so my yoga mat is a safe place for me to try these things on, for me to practice these principles, and just to see what it feels like to put these principles into my body. So for instance, last week we talked about boundaries, and for some reason, practicing boundaries on the mat in a place where I don't actually have to be bombarded with real world situations just feels like a good place for me to try it on. So I invite you to try it on, to see what it feels like, to take a concept and then what would it be like to physically embody? Just something that you can keep in mind as we move through this episode, but then also when we take it to the mat. Every episode includes a little bit of yoga for embodied understanding. So I hope that you hear something today that helps you, something that keeps you coming back to this podcast is really a resource, something that, you know, between the mat and the meeting, if you can't get to your mat, if you can't get to a meeting, or if, you know, you just need someone who could provide an alternative way of looking at things, then I invite you to use this podcast as a resource. So I hope that you hear something that helps. Today, I want to talk about contrary action. This is something that I've heard in the rooms of recovery, and I really love this idea of contrary action. And the best way for me to describe contrary action is through one of my favorite Seinfeld episodes. There was a time in my life where if I could really compare anything to an episode of Seinfeld, it just made sense to me. I watched Seinfeld at probably an inappropriately young age, but there was something about a show about nothing that was a show about everything. So, you know, not everybody's into Seinfeld. I am. So if you hear this episode and you're not into Seinfeld, again, take what you like and leave the rest. But if you are a Seinfeldian, then you might remember the episode called Opposite George. Opposite George! George Costanza, who is one of the characters on the show, basically comes to the understanding that every instinct that he has is wrong. Every time he has an instinct and he acts on that instinct, he has a negative outcome. So in this episode of Seinfeld, George decides for this 30-minute episode that he's going to embrace opposite George. Everything that he thinks, he does the opposite. And in this episode of Seinfeld, he actually has a really good outcome. Suddenly he's like got the job and got the girl and everything is going good for George. And so when I think of contrary action, I think of opposite George or opposite Kari. What would happen if I do the opposite? And so contrary action is a recovery tool or just a life skill tool where we can consider that sometimes our default programming is flawed or it doesn't get us the results that we want. And it's just the way that we know how to do it. It's the way that we do it in the world. And so what would happen if we tried doing the opposite? So sometimes I think about that. If I have an instinct to do something and I'm not quite sure if that's the right thing to do, then sometimes I'll just do the opposite. So if I want to do something that feels a little impulsive, what would be the opposite? The opposite might be to do nothing. If I have an impulse to, do something that in the past has gotten me results that don't have favorable outcomes, well, what would happen if I did the opposite? And there actually is something in the Yoga Sutras about this as well, about doing the opposite action. That if we have an urge, that we could do the opposite. And so there is something, in ancient wisdom about this, about doing the opposite. And so, I really wonder what could happen if I did the opposite of certain urges. Now, some urges are good, right? Like the urge to help people, but sometimes I help too much. And so, really this is kind of an internal thing, something that I could use to internally gauge myself. Is the opposite going to get me a more favorable result? And so this is something that I try on from time to time. Contrary action, do the opposite George. So, I also think about how this applies to my yoga practice. Because as I said, I like to see how this also works in my body. How could I feel my way through this? And, I think about in yoga, we practice expansion and contraction. The idea is that when we're doing one thing on one side of the body, it's often creating the opposite on the other side. So for instance, if I'm in a forward fold and I'm contracting the front side of my body, then I'm expanding the back side of my body. Or when I think about in a vinyasa practice, how we move with the breath, when I'm rising up, when I'm expanding, I'm breathing in, and when I breathe out, I'm doing the opposite. I'm contracting, I'm curling in, I'm hugging in, I'm squeezing in. So I think about the way that force of opposites works even in the body and on the mat. When I'm taking a backward bend and I'm expanding through my chest and I'm opening up and broadening my chest, I'm also creating a compression in the back side of my body by drawing my shoulder blades into my spine. So by an action on one side of the body, I'm doing the opposite action on the other side of my body. And so, and in this situation, it's not good or bad. It's neutral because, in a backward bend, it's the appropriate thing to expand my chest and then draw my shoulder blades in to help expand the chest. So it's not that doing the opposite is good or bad. I sort of want to take out this idea that there's good and bad action. I think that that's one way that the idea of karma gets kind of mixed up. We hear often or we talk often about good karma and bad karma, but karma is neither good or bad. The word karma comes from the Sanskrit word kur, which means to do or to make. So karma is just, it's action. It's to make action, to do action. It's not good or bad action. It's just action. It's a neutral concept. And so I'm not even saying that doing the opposite is good or bad. It's changing the outcome, right? Or having a more favorable outcome, something that maybe will create a new experience in the world or a new experience in the body. Because I think about the idea that if we do what we've always done, we get what we've always got. So if we're trying to create something new, if we're trying to do a new thing or have a new outcome in the world, because we're tired of the way that always goes, then we could do the opposite. We could try something different. And sometimes if we don't know what that different thing could be, we could just do the opposite, right? So I'm not even saying that doing the opposite is good or bad. I'm just saying it's something different. And if we don't know what that something different could look like, well, we could try the opposite, contrary action. So this is how it makes sense to me on the mat, because that's a place where I want to start labeling the contrary as the good thing or the bad thing. Oh, if I do it the way that I've always done, that must be the bad way. But that's not what I'm saying. And it makes sense to me if I think about my body movement and I think about what this looks like on the yoga mat. It's not good or bad. It's just the action. It's just the next thing, the next right thing. And so that's how it makes sense to me if I think about it in my body. that it's neither good nor bad. It's just doing something different. And so if we want a different result, if we want a different thing to happen than the thing that always happens, we can try doing the opposite. So those are my thoughts on contrary action. And so I take that to you for this week. What would it look like to do the opposite? If there's something that you're always doing, if there's an outcome that you're always getting, what would it look like to do the opposite? So for instance, if yelling at your partner or yelling at your kid, or, if there's a certain action that you take that gets you unfavorable results, what would it look like to do the opposite? Like if you didn't yell. And I'm not even saying speak softly or even speak kindly. I'm just saying what would happen if you did the opposite. If you usually yell and then you don't yell. Or if you usually do a certain action, what would happen if you did the opposite just by not doing that action? And so that makes sense to me. That's something that I can try on and explore new results, not even better results. I'm not saying the result will be better. I'm just saying the result will be different. And that helps me in my recovery to not necessarily label things better, worse, good, bad, because then you really get into sort of the morality of, the right action for me might not be the right action for you. And it's neither good nor bad. It's just different. It's just, for some people, learning to embrace anger is a good thing. For me, anger is a default. Like if something happens for me, my default reaction is anger. So if I'm going to do the opposite of get angry, for me would look like getting curious. Because it's easy for me to get angry. Angry is just like, there we are, angry, So what would happen for me if I did the opposite of get angry? It might look like getting curious. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be sweet. Like to me, the opposite of anger isn't sweet, it's curious. Rather than just jumping to anger, what would happen if I kept an open mind? Or if I recognize the anger and decided, okay, I see the anger, but I'm not going to act on the anger. That to me would look like doing the opposite. So that's what I bring for you today. Contrary action, do the opposite. What would it look like? What would it look like to do the opposite action of the thing that you usually do? Not because it's good or bad, but because we want a different result. And if we don't know what a better course of action even could be, we could just try doing the opposite and see what happens and stay curious. Because if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. And maybe you like what you've got, so there's nothing there to change. But if there is a result that you're getting in your life and it's not a desired result, we could try doing the opposite. See how that works out. So let's bring that to the mat today. Let's see what it looks like on the mat, just embodying the opposite. When we take cat pose and we round the back and tuck the chin, we're creating a compression in the front side, but we're opening up the back side. So it's just a different opposite. It's just, compression in one area is expansion in the other area. And it's neither good nor bad. It's just the action. So today, let's explore contrary action on the mat and see what physical embodiment feels like, so that when we feel it in our body, it might help to set these things in the mind a little differently. So that's what I bring you today, my friend. Contrary action, do the opposite. And with that being said, let's take it to the mat. Okay, one more thing before we take it to the mat, because I wanted to actually look it up in the Yoga Sutras. I'm not really one to just say, it's in the Yoga Sutras without actually backing that up with something. So I actually pulled out a copy of the Yoga Sutras. This is called Yoga Discipline of Freedom. And it's just a translation of the Yoga Sutras by Barbara Stoller Miller. And so this is book 2, and Yoga Sutra 33 says, and this is in chapter 2, book 2, part 2, when one is plagued by ideas that pervert the moral principles and observances, one can counter them by cultivating the opposite. Cultivating the opposite is realizing that perverse ideas such as the idea of violence, result in endless suffering and ignorance. Whether the ideas are acted out, instigated, or sanctioned, whether motivated by greed, anger, or delusion, whether mild, moderate, or extreme. So there it is. It's in the Yoga Sutras. Do the opposite. So I just wanted to bring that to you, and you can definitely read more into that. Do the opposite. So with that being said, we will take it to the mat. Welcome back, my friend. Here we are on the mat, and we're exploring the idea of contrary action. So let's see how this works in the body, and just keep in mind that something on one side creates a different experience on the other side. So with that being said, let's get started in supine butterfly. Come to lie down on your back. Bring the soles of your feet to touch, and let your knees fall open. Place one hand over your chest, one hand over your belly, and take a big deep breath. In through your nose, and out of your nose. And begin by noticing the impact of the inhale and the exhale on your hands. The way the breath lifts the hands subtly, and then slowly with the exhale, the hands gently come down. And just notice that subtle opposition, the up and down, the in and out. Lengthen your legs forward. Take your arms over your head. Take a big full body stretch. Open your arms into a T. Hug your knees to your chest. Drop your knees over to the right and turn your gaze to the left. And notice the opposites when we twist. In one side of the body, there is a contraction, and in the opposite side, we're lengthening. Just notice where you feel these contrary actions in your body. And be curious. And keep moving the breath. Notice the impact of the breath on the twist. Where do you feel expansion? Where do you feel contraction? And then draw your knees back to the center. Take your knees to the left. Turn your gaze to the right. When I twist, I notice that one side of my body feels longer and the other side feels like it's hugging in, creating that sense of contraction. But that contraction allows for opposite side expansion. Take a big breath in and out. And gently bring your knees back to the center. Put your hands right behind your knees, catch your thighs, and take a couple of rocks up and down. And come up to a seat and then make your way to all fours. Take a few rounds of cat-cow, specifically with the intention of noticing the contrary actions, that when you drop your belly and you lift your chest for cow pose, notice the way your shoulders draw in. Notice where you feel the sense of contraction. And yet at the same time, an opening in your chest, in your throat. And then do the opposite. Push the floor away, tuck your chin to your chest, compress your front side to open the back. And do it again. And just notice how it feels to do the opposite. And keep moving your breath. And then take some movement from side to side. When you contract one side, you lengthen the opposite. Just notice how this feels. I'm not asking you to think about it. I'm asking you to feel it. To notice what doing the opposite feels like in the body. So continue to move through a few rounds. And then come back to all fours. Stretch your right arm forward with your thumb pointing up. Look forward, hug your belly in. Take your left leg back with all 5 of your toes pointing down. And just stay here a moment, reaching forward and back. Take a big inhale. Pull your elbow to your knee. Squeeze it in. Inhale forward and back. Elbow to knee. One more. Inhale forward and back. Exhale, elbow to knee. Squeeze it in tight. And set everything down. Take a round of cat-cow. We're just exploring opposites. Now come back to neutral. Look forward. Extend your left arm forward with your thumb pointing up. Hug your belly in. Stretch your right leg back with all 5 toes pointing down. Set your eyes. Take a big breath in. Elbow to knee, squeeze it in. Forward and back. Elbow to knee. One more, expand. Exhale, contract, pull it in. And set everything down. Take a round of cat-cow. Make your way to downward facing dog. Lift your tailbone to the sky. And just work around in your down dog. Walk your dog out. Pedal one knee and straighten the opposite leg. And then do the opposite. Be at play with doing the opposite. Just see how it feels in your body. Sway your hips, one side then the other. Notice where you feel the sensation in your body. And lift your heels up, bend your knees, look forward, step to the top. Halfway lift, put your palms on your shins, lengthen your head forward. And fold into ragdoll. Catch your elbows, open your feet up, at least hip width. Soften your knees and allow the crown of your head to fall towards the floor. And notice the compression in your front side that creates opening in your backside. By allowing the head and the arms to hang heavy, you're creating a lengthening in the backside of your body, all of the muscles in your back, the muscles in the backs of your legs. Notice this contrary action. Shake your head out. Bounce your knees. Release your elbows. Place your hands on your hips. Stand up. Reach your arms up over your head. Take a big breath in. Interlace your hands behind your back. Find a clasp. Stretch your knuckles down towards the earth. Draw your shoulder blades in. And then lift your chin and your chest up towards the sky. Now we're doing the opposite. By drawing in the back body, we lift and expand through the front side body. Lift up your chin to open your throat. Open your chest. With an inhale, slowly come back up to neutral. Release your bind. Reach your arms up over your head. And bow forward. Halfway lift, lengthen your spine. Downward facing dog. Walk your feet to the back of your mat. Set your eyes between your toes. Soften your knees. Come down to your knees. Put your hands on your low back, right on your hips. Take a big breath in. We're coming into camel pose. Lift your pelvis forward up towards the ceiling and begin to open up your chest. Hug your elbows and your shoulder blades in towards your spine. And notice the way the contraction in the back of your body, hugging in your shoulders, hugging in your elbows, creates this big expansion across your chest. And then slowly come up. Have a seat on your heels. Close your eyes for a moment. And just be still. Feel your breath moving through your body. After movement, notice how it feels to be still. Doing one thing might help us appreciate doing another. So by moving, we might appreciate being still. And after being still, we may appreciate the opportunity to move. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen and to practice with me today. I hope that you heard something that helps you, and you can always do this yoga practice a little longer and take a little more time with it, even do it again. Thank you for sharing this space with me and for coming and showing up. And I'll see you next week, sweet friend. Thank you for listening to the Luminous Recovery Yoga podcast. If you'd like to support the show, please consider joining my Patreon or leaving a comment and review if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or YouTube.